Salut, bonjour et bienvenue. Hello and welcome to City Breaks Paris. I'm Marion Jones. If you're a regular listener, you might be a little confused because we did Paris ages ago. But I've decided to revisit it because I keep thinking of other things it would be nice to do and talk about. And so this episode, number 23 in the series, is entitled Fontainebleau and Vaux-le-Vicomte, because it is a visit to two of the finest châteaux which are very easy to visit in day trips or even half-day trips from Paris. There's lots to see when you get there. They both have very interesting stories attached, and really, they're just unmissable. So, going to start with Fontainebleau and then move on in the second half to Vaux-le-Vicomte. In each case then, a word or two on how to get there, a little bit on what you can see when you arrive, but not too much of that because I'm against lists of furniture and whatnot, and definitely an emphasis on the stories attached to them so that when you get there you will know what you're looking at. Okay then, Fontainebleau, which was a royal residence for 7 centuries, inhabited in fact by all the kings of France between the 12th and the 19th centuries, many of whom added bits and pieces, which immediately explains why it looks so higgledy-piggledy, architecturally speaking. You will see medieval turrets, a Renaissance facade. You can find Napoleon's initials in gold on the gates. No wonder then it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. To get there, you just need to go to the Gare de Lyon in central Paris and get a train to the station with Fontainebleau in its name. It's actually called Fontainebleau Avant. It'll take about 40 minutes. When you get there, there will be a bus outside the station that takes you to the château. You can actually walk it in about half an hour if you prefer, or of course there are taxis. The Château of Fontainebleau started life as a hunting lodge, but one of the early kings, Louis VII in fact, in the very first year of his reign, 1137, issued a royal charter from Fontainebleau, which put it on the map. He also built some chapels here, one of which was consecrated by no less a person than Thomas Becket, and so it gradually was establishing itself as an important seat of French kings. And it underwent a particular flourishing in the Renaissance, thanks largely to King François I, or Francis I as perhaps we better call him in English. He really was Renaissance man, a contemporary of Henry VIII of England. Both of them loved architecture and designing fancy palaces, and Francis certainly left his mark here, particularly in a room you will not forget if you see it, the Gallery of Francis it's called, a long narrowish room built in 1528 to connect the king's apartments with the monastery that was just next door. And it's beautiful. The lower half is all decorated with walnut panelling, lavishly embellished with gilded carvings, the letter F for his name, the fleur de lis, so that little flower that's the symbol of French royalty, the salamander, because that was Francis's personal emblem, and above the panelling, beautiful paintings, frescoes by the best Italian artists of the day. So one of those rooms where no expense was spared. Francis, in fact, was so proud of his gallery that he had only one key made for it, which he kept around his neck, so that only he could decide which very favoured individuals would be allowed to go inside. During Francis's reign, hunting was particularly popular at Fontainebleau, and in the biography of him written by Leonie Frieda, I read quite a lot of interesting stuff about that topic. About, for example, how he used to spend 150,000 gold crowns a year maintaining the royal hunt. So that meant hounds, huntsmen, dozens of grooms, all presided over by someone called the Grand Huntsman of France. And here, from the biography of Francis I, is Leonie Frieda on the topic of hunting. This grand pursuit was taken enormously seriously, and the animals hunted, which included boar, wolves, deer, and even otters, were pursued and slaughtered with great pomp and ceremony, with a gilded sword or spear, to the accompaniment of ritualistic horn music and whooping. Francis saw hunting as a pastime to be enjoyed whatever the season. He galloped fast and recklessly through his preferred terrain of forest at Blois and Fontainebleau, hacking away at any branches that obstructed his progress. It was a hazardous, thrilling occasion, and one that could potentially have been fatal. One time he lost his way completely and had to take shelter in a cave on a winter night, nearly freezing to death before he was discovered. But there were other interesting pursuits too. For example, Leonie Frieda explains that Francis issued a decree stating that one copy of every book published in France should be brought here to Fontainebleau, and the collection grew and grew, and eventually it became the nucleus of what is now the Bibliothèque Nationale, so the National Library, in central Paris. There was a lot of emphasis on entertainments too, so after a day hunting there'd be lots of evening events, games of tennis, dancing, concerts, masked balls, and, as she puts it, wine would be taken. Sometimes a royal jester would be brought along to liven things up, and there would be raucous jollity all evening until, as she puts it, the king finally retired to his vast canopied bed at around midnight. Francis's son, Henri II, Henry II, who followed him, was just as extravagant, and he left his mark in the shape of the Renaissance-style ballroom, which is one of the must-sees when you go to look round. Do look up at the intricate ceiling panels, every single one of which has a gilded H for Henri in the middle. If you look round further, you'll notice intertwining letters H and D, a reference to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and also gilded crescent moons, the crescent moon being his symbol. It really is quite the Renaissance room, imposing fireplace, copies of classical Roman statues, a musician's gallery, up above where the musicians would gather to play for all the balls and concerts that took place here. Lots more monarchs followed, all with their own ideas. Henry IV, for example, spent a lot of time and money on the gardens, creating a large parterre, a formal garden, a 1,200-metre-long Grand Canal, all of this 60 years before Louis XIV did the same at Versailles. Henry had a carp pond installed, which you can still see, where guests could go fishing and enjoy boating parties, and he also had built something called a jeu de paume court, a forerunner really of modern tennis courts, an indoor version, a bit like a squash court maybe. He was another one for extravagance and ostentation and parties, and his reign was referred to as un temps de splendeur, a time of splendour. In the 17th century, Anne of Austria, so Louis XIV's mother, left us the Queen Mother's wing, sumptuously decorated, another ornate ceiling, this time bearing her initial. And the king who spent the longest here of all, because he reigned for so long, was Louis XIV. So yes, we think of him much more as in connection with Versailles, but he spent a lot of time at Fontainebleau before Versailles was finished. In fact, he used Fontainebleau really as a little bit of a practice run, and if you visit both châteaux, I think you will see lots of similarities. Versailles, of course, though, even more splendid and grander. And you can see two more examples of excess and beauty installed by Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette just before the Revolution. In a little suite of rooms, the Queen's bedchamber and the Queen's boudoir, you can see the decorations which Marie Antoinette had put up. All the finest materials in use, mother of pearl, gilded bronze, satin, ebony. You can see a few items which actually belonged to her, her writing desk and little table, for example, but as the guidebook puts it, much of it did not last because it was looted or auctioned after the Revolution. However, getting rid of the monarchy did not put an end to splendour and ostentation, because it wasn't a decade or two until Napoleon came along and France was an empire. As the guidebook puts it, quote, "When he took up residence at Fontainebleau, Napoleon had reached the height of his power and wanted to follow in the footsteps of the monarchs who came before him. And one of the first ways in which he did this was by reconvening some of the rooms for a visit from the Pope. He invited Pope Pius VII to come to Paris in 1804 to crown Napoleon as emperor. Actually, when it got to it, Napoleon crowned himself. But anyway, the Pope did come, and he did stay at Fontainebleau in the newly decorated suite prepared for him. And at the same time, Napoleon oversaw the transformation of what had been the king's bedroom into a throne room, in which he had sumptuous decorations based on his symbols, an imperial eagle, the letter N, and, wait for it, a throne, specially brought from the Tuileries Palace. You can see all this today. You can visit his bedroom and see the bed made especially for him, crowned with an imperial eagle, decorated, as the guidebook puts it, with allegorical sculptures representing glory, justice and abundance. You can see his study too, a little room where he had a camp bed set up so that he could work through the night and have a quick rest now and then. You can see his library and his map room, reminders that even though he came to Fontainebleau really to relax, he was still ruling an empire. Although, in fact, Fontainebleau was also the scene of his demise when it finally came. And you can visit the salle d'abdication, the abdication room, the little room where he signed the document which put an end to his reign on April the 6th in 1814. And if you go out to the main courtyard, you can stand on the horseshoe staircase where he gave the dramatic final speech to bid farewell to his men. So the soldiers of the old guard were all lined up in the courtyard. Napoleon stood on the top of the steps and began, quote, "Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years you have constantly been by my side on the road to honour and glory." And he ended as follows, "Receive my thanks. I cannot embrace you all. I will embrace your leader. I will also embrace your flag. Come, General, bring forward the flag." I read a description of this scene in a book called Napoleon and Josephine by Evangeline Bruce, and she describes him kissing the flag and writes that, quote, "The troops could not hold back their tears." Then she relates how he was escorted to his carriage and driven away, at which point, she says, the guard burned their flags and swallowed the ashes. And incidentally, if Napoleon is a particular interest of yours, the Museum of Napoleon is also sited here at Fontainebleau, so you can spend some time looking at a whole range of mementos, portraits and medals and souvenirs from his various military campaigns. And in pride of place, a gold leaf from the crown which he wore during his coronation. As you may well know, the end of Napoleon was not the end of empire in France, because there was a second empire later in the 19th century, Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew in fact, and the Empress Eugenie, and they too left their mark. She was very fond of Asian-style art, so you can visit her lacquer salon, as it's called, which was her study, and there's a Chinese museum housing all the items that she collected, and he left behind a 400-seat theatre. When that empire fell in 1870, the Château Fontainebleau was closed. It was later reopened for various other uses. It was a military hospital, for example, during the First World War, and after World War II, it was here that NATO set up their military headquarters. More recently, it was at Fontainebleau that the French equestrian team trained for the 2024 Olympics. So there's lots to see, there's history around every corner. You can definitely spend at least half a day looking round the chateau. And actually, if you want to wander the grounds and maybe even set off on one of the forest trails in the surrounding forests, you could definitely spend the whole day there. So that's Fontainebleau. And for the second half of the podcast, we're off to a different chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, actually, as far as I'm aware, the only chateau surrounding Paris that wasn't started by a member of royalty, and thereby hangs quite a tale, which I'll be telling you in a minute. But first things first, how are you going to get there? Again, from the Gare de Lyon in central Paris. This time you take a train to somewhere called Melun, which is spelled M-E-L-U-N. Take about half an hour. The chateau's a few minutes' drive from the station. In high season, there's a shuttle bus from the chateau to the station and back. There's information about that on the chateau website, but actually there are lots of taxis milling about, so you can easily do it that way if you prefer. It's about a 10-minute drive, I think. And don't forget to take your taxi driver's phone number so you can ring them to come and pick you up when you're ready. Opinions vary, of course they do, but I've certainly seen more than one person saying that they think Vaux-le-Vicomte might be the most beautiful chateau anywhere in the Parisian region, and actually I think I might tend to agree with that. When I asked AI for a description, it waxed eloquent about the harmony of the architecture, the opulent interiors and the grand French gardens. its luminous limestone exterior and iconic central dome, its symmetrically designed grounds with mirror pools and intricate boxwood parterre, all of which, yes. But for a more poetic description, here is one Madame de Montespan, actually the mistress of Louis XIV, I should say one of his mistresses, who once went to a party there. More about that in a minute, but afterwards wrote this description of how beautiful she found it. This was in 1661, when the château was more or less new. Quote, "On reaching Vaux-le-Vicomte, how great and general was our amazement! It was not the well-appointed residence of a minister. It was not a human habitation that presented itself to our view. It was a veritable fairy palace. All in this brilliant dwelling was stamped with the mark of opulence and of exquisite taste in art. Marbles, balustrades, vast staircases, columns, statues, groups, bas-relief, vases and pictures were scattered here and there in rich profusion, besides cascades and fountains innumerable. The large salon, octagonal in shape, had a high vaulted ceiling, and its flooring of mosaic looked like a rich carpet embellished with birds, butterflies, arabesques, fruit and flowers. On either side of the main edifice, and somewhat in the rear, the architect had placed smaller buildings, yet all of them ornamented in the same sumptuous fashion, and these served to throw the château into relief. In these adjoining pavilions there were baths, a theatre, a poem ground, that's a tennis court, swings, a chapel, billiard rooms, and other salons. So, how did all this come about? It is the story, very dramatic story, of one man, Nicolas Fouquet, who, in the mid-17th century, was chief superintendent of finances to Louis XIV, which meant that he had quite a lot of money to spend, and he bought some land here, halfway between Vincennes and Fontainebleau, thinking, I imagine, that that would make his château on one of the royal routes, liable to be visited by the king, and he started dreaming about what he wanted built there. He wanted his château to be du jamais vu, which means something never seen before. He wanted it to be, as he put it, un ravissement pour les yeux, a delight for the eyes. And so he hired the very best, a trio really of experts, the architect Louis Le Vaux, the landscape gardener André Lenôtre. You might have heard of him. He did lots of work at the Tuileries and Versailles and all sorts of other palaces. And thirdly, Charles Lebrun, the artist, who was going to mastermind the sumptuous interior decoration. So, a few years elapsed while the château was built, and then came the evening that Nicolas Fouquet had been dreaming about, when he was going to have a most amazing party, invite the king to come and admire his château, and really be very, very proud of himself, except that this was the evening when everything went terribly wrong. To loop back just for a moment, what are you going to see when you get there? Start with the amazing entrance hall, marble floors, statues, pillars, and at the far end, windows opening out onto the wonderful garden. For the briefest of summaries of what you might find as you tour around, on the ground floor, staterooms aplenty, the king's antechamber, the king's bedroom, and whatnot. Up on the first floor, Monsieur and Madame Fouquet's rooms, and crucially the entrance up to the dome. Don't miss that, because if you climb up the 36 metres, you will have the most amazing view of the whole of the grounds. There's a lower ground floor too, with, I think it said 18 rooms, kitchens and wine cellars and whatnot, and lots of interesting information down there actually about the food that was served here. And of course you're going to want to see the gardens too. Beautiful. Lawns, step terraces, all leading down to the Grand Canal, grottos, flower beds, little box hedges, ponds, cascading fountains, statues, no expense spared. But what's really most interesting about Vaux-le-Vicomte, I think, is the story of the party held that evening by Nicolas Fouquet, which, incidentally, if you decide to hire the audio guide, which is available in English, they will tell you in quite dramatic form as you find your way around. It opens as you stand in the hallway, with the excited whisperings of all the servants whispering to each other, "Le roi va venir, the king's coming, the king's coming." So we're on the evening in August 1661 when the party was due to take place. High summer, really good weather. The royal party arrive and are taken on a tour of the grounds. So you can imagine their coach rattling down the central Grande Allée, admiring pools and fountains to either side, and then stopping to look back at what I've seen described as the most beautiful perspective in the world. And then finally, after they'd seen all around, they were brought back to the château for the feast, which had been specially prepared by a chef, François I. He too became rather famous later, and he had been told that his task was, quote, to dazzle the king with the setting, the table decoration, and the audacity, harmony, rarity, opulence and richness of the food served. 24 violinists had been put in place to create some musical entertainment, and a whole array of dishes was served: pheasants and quails, lobster soups, crab, the choicest meats, the finest crafted desserts. After which, lots more entertainment, so people went out to the garden to find a little theatre had been set up, and that Molière had written specially for this event a new ballet comédie. After that, there was a firework extravaganza, so all the grottos and statues lit up, all to music played by the king's musketeers. Quite the evening then. And the writer Jean de La Fontaine was there as a guest, and he commented afterwards, Vaux never looked more beautiful than it did on that evening. You can hear a but is coming, I think, and sure enough, things took, if you were Nicolas Fouquet at least, a dreadful turn, because the king, Louis XIV, quite well known for his own ostentation, showing off, etc., was very jealous. He summoned Le Fouquet to his suite that night and accused him of trying to outshine the king. What was he doing building something so sumptuous? As far as I'm aware, said Louis, apparently, it is I who am king. I think at this moment Fouquet probably realised things were going to go badly wrong, and he offered to hand the whole château over to Louis, who refused it, saying, "What would anybody think of me if I accept a gift from a subject?" And to cut the story short, it took a few weeks, but Fouquet was then arrested. As the writer Voltaire put it, at 6 p.m. on the 17th of August, Fouquet was King of France. At 2 o'clock the next morning, he was a nobody. Actually, there is a bit more to this story than I've said so far, because there was a lot of political intrigue enmeshed. I think it is definitely true that Louis was so jealous that he wanted to stop Fouquet having this treasure, but it's also true that some of his rivals, remember he had a very high up post in the king's court, some of his rivals had been suggesting to Louis that Fouquet could only be as rich as he was because he was embezzling royal funds. He was put on trial, charged with maladministration and lèse-majesté. I checked to see what that actually means, and it said anything from insulting the monarch to full-blown treason. So a nice handy catch-all, really. The trial lasted 3 years, was the talk of Paris. Some people supported Le Fouquet, others didn't, but the result was eventually he was sentenced to life imprisonment and taken off to the Alps to a little place called Pignerol, where he was imprisoned and where he spent the next 19 years of his life until he died there. Meanwhile, Louis confiscated all the fine furniture and art from the château. I've even read that he dug up all the plants in the gardens, and he took all of that and the gifted trio, the architect, the landscape designer, the artist, with him to work for him on his new project, Versailles. And at the end of the audio guide, there's a sad little description of Fouquet in his prison in the Alps, reminiscing about the beautiful château he'd created at Vaux-le-Vicomte. Proud, it says, of the harmony he had created between l'art et la nature, so art and nature. So then, Vaux-le-Vicomte, definitely an interesting excursion from Paris. Certainly for half a day. You could, I think, spend a whole day there if you wanted to look round the grounds properly. And there is at least one restaurant on site. In fact, it's called L'Écureuil, which means the squirrel. I did wonder why, and I found out later that actually the squirrel was the emblem of the Fouquet family, and their motto was Qui non ascendet, which means, what heights will he not scale? So a call to ambition and all the things you can achieve if you really strive for it. Ironically, of course, the fact being that the great heights to which Nicolas Fouquet ascended turned out to be his undoing. Anyway, both of those visits, Fontainebleau and Vaux-le-Vicomte, I would highly recommend if you're in Paris for a few days and want to get out of the city on at least one occasion, or perhaps if you're a regular visitor and like to just see something you haven't seen before on one of your visits. Don't forget that there'll be a blog post to go along with the podcast on which you'll find all the main details, useful links, some pictures, a handy aide-memoire if you've listened to the podcast once and want to recall this or that from it. And if you're new to City Breaks, I hope you perhaps take the moment to look back over the rest of the Paris series, where there are 22 episodes, with lots more tales of history from all the sites that you might want to visit when you're there, or of course have a browse and look at some of our other series. There are a dozen or more cities, all chosen for their historical interest or their links to literature, aimed really at anybody who likes to be well informed when they go to visit somewhere and know the stories behind the buildings and the sites that they see. So that's it for today. The next episode I'm planning is also on Paris. Another couple of ideas for days out, easy days out from the city centre. And then before too long after that, there'll be a whole new city to explore. I'm just in the middle of researching that. Thank you then for listening, or in French, merci pour l'écoute. And I hope very much that you'll be joining me again at some future moment. Au revoir.